2 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning of verse 6. It says, the point is this: whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. And whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must give, as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency in all things at all times, you may abound in every good work. As it is written, he has distributed freely. He has given to the poor. His righteousness endures forever. He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way, to be generous in every way, which through us will produce thanksgiving to God. Now, obviously, this text is calling our attention to the concept of giving, but also tying our heart for giving to the measure by which we receive. So if we have a heart to give bountifully, and we give bountifully, then God answers that gift and rewards us with a bountiful harvest. We give based on how we feel in our heart towards God. How we feel, how we love Him, how we express ourselves to Him is seen evidently in our gift. But in order for us to have a heart towards God, I think it's important that we realize that we really should be constantly thinking about Him. Like, if what we do is flowing from our heart, then our heart must be flowing from a place of awareness and appreciation for Him. So let me set this up like this. This weekend, Claire Bear, my youngest, she was running at the state cross-country meet in Tallahassee. And I mean, I've spent some time in Tallahassee through my young adult years, and it was always a pretty wild time, to be perfectly honest with you. And I was on my way to Tallahassee, maybe just thinking about some things and like, whew, thank God for forgiveness and mercy and redemption and all of those things. And I've kind of been in a season recently where when I'm in the car, I really don't listen to any music, really. I've just been listening to a lot of just speaking, or no podcast, and I'm just in my head and I'm just thinking. And so from Lakeland to Tallahassee, for the most part, it was just quiet. I didn't have anything playing. I was just thinking, considering, praying. Then I'd run out of things to pray in the Spirit a little bit, run out of just think some more, just, I don't know how you guys do. That's kind of how I do a long road trip if I'm by myself. And, but then when I turned on the I-10 and started going toward Tallahassee, at some point I got bored, and so I turned the radio on. Now, some of you that have been around, you understand how I listen to the radio. If you're new, let me just explain what I mean by listening to the radio. It means I'm not streaming anything off of my phone. I just literally turn the radio on, that thing that says FM. You push FM, and then there's a button that says scan on your radio. And you can push that, and it will just go from radio station to radio station to radio station. And it doesn't sit anywhere very long, just long enough for you to know what's on. And this is how I listen to the radio. I just scan the whole way. And a song will come on that I like, and I'm like, yeah, and then it leaves, and I just let it leave. And it goes on to the next one, and I might not like that song at all, but I still just listen to the song that I don't like for a minute. And it'll just go forever. Like, it just keeps going. It'll just go. And I'm a little bit of a sucker, though, for like a good country family song. Like where they're talking about your wife and your kids and loving Jesus and cursing and drinking beer, stuff like that. Like I love I don't know, those songs are sort of fun. And so one hits that I'd never heard before. And this guy's talking about meeting an 80-year-old and he's buying dirt. He's gonna buy dirt. And I'm like, buying dirt sounds fun. I take it off scan so I can just listen to it and enjoy it. And the guy starts talking about finding somebody you love and buying a ring and makes your knee fall to the ground and put a little money in the offering plate and send a prayer up to heaven. I'm like, Jesus. I had more faith than most Christian songs these days, to be honest with you. Sorry, that was, worship team will really beat me down for that one. But anyhow, so I just had a moment. I cut the radio off. I'm like, Jesus, I thank you for your goodness. And then I remembered the last time, 30 years ago, I was on that road on my way to Tallahassee to go to that exact cross-country park. But that time, my wife was on a scholarship running cross-country for Berry College in Georgia. She was running down in Tallahassee. We were just dating at the time. And so being a good boyfriend, wanting to go and support my girlfriend, I drove up to watch her. And I'll be honest, my drive up was stupid. You get bored with the road. It's not just scan back in the day. No reason in glorifying the devil this morning. But let's just say my ride this time was very different. And I just was so thankful to God for pulling me out of Egypt, for taking me by the hand and pulling me out of that lifestyle. And I'm on my way. I was on my way to go see my girlfriend, and now I'm on my way to go see my daughter because I married that girl that I fell in love with, whom God gave to me, and she gave me the 4 most awesome human beings ever on the planet. And I'm going to watch my youngest run at the same place that 30 years earlier I was going to watch my girlfriend run. It's one of those full circle moments where you're just coming into this remembrance of the goodness of God. And I guess what I'm saying is, I am so overwhelmed with thankfulness when I come into his presence. I cannot come empty-handed. I cannot come without a praise in my mouth. For the Lord is good, and his mercy endures forever. And we see this in the text because this is the question that I get all the time. Shawn, do I have to give this much? And I want to deal with that. Do I have to give this much? But I want to stop at the middle of the question. Do I have to give? Because this text here is very clear. It says each one must give. And we'll read the rest of it, but could we just wrestle with that for a minute? Each one must give. Why the command to give? We see this when the Apostle Paul was quoting the words of Jesus in Acts chapter 20 and verse 35. He said, remember the words of our Lord Jesus, how he himself said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. We all like to receive. We all like to be appreciated. We all like to open stuff up. We're going to step into the Christmas season. Everybody wants to have at least something under the tree, at least a gift. There's a feeling, there's an emotion, there's a joy that comes from receiving something. But Jesus says that joy is actually surpassed by giving. I think every single one of us knows what it's like to give something to somebody so that we can watch their face and see joy. There's a joy that comes on us when they love what we did for them. Jesus says it's more blessed to give than to receive. They run these studies in communities all the time, in nations all the time, rich countries, poor countries, and what they find time and time and time again is that the countries that are the most generous, those places where they share the most, or those places where they give the most, in the most generous of countries, they actually live the longest. And the reason why is because there is something that happens to you physically when you are a giver. There's something about that emotional moment that just causes you to be more healthy than if you were not generous, if you were not giving. So Jesus says, look, it's more blessed to give than it is to receive. Each one must give. We see this in Romans chapter 13 and verse 7. By the inspiration of the Spirit, the Apostle Paul says, give to each one what is owed to them. Taxes, to whom taxes are owed. Revenue, to whom revenue is owed. Respect, to whom respect is owed. And honor, to whom honor is owed. I don't know how you feel about taxes. They're necessary. I don't think anybody wants to give more than you should have to. Whatever that number is, we'll let the professionals come up with that. But, the text is saying, look, if there is something that is expected of you, then you should give that. So we should give that tax. We shouldn't look to avoid that. And then revenue, to whom revenue is owed. If somebody does work for you, then you owe them, right? You give them revenue. If you buy something at a store, they're going to give you a product and you give them money, or they give you a service, perform something, you give them money. Revenue, to whom revenue is owed. And then he goes on, he says, respect, to whom respect is owed. Now, respect is one of those conversations that, quite frankly, gets a little bit of disdain in the generation in which we live. We don't really like to give respect anymore. And we actually have these conversations where we are almost dismantling the structure of respect, and we're not replacing it with anything. Now, let me just say, I'm all for, I like to reform things. I'm all into deconstruction. I enjoy the process. If something is broken, let's fix it. If something's not working, let's fix it. But it seems like in our conversation with respect, all we're wanting to do is remove the things, the gestures that we do that show respect, but we're not putting anything back. We just want to take away the yes, ma'am. We'll take away the ma'am and we'll just go with yes. We'll take away the yes, sir, and we'll just go with yes. And if we're just trying to remove a little bit of Southern hospitality because it's cheesy and quirky and all that, okay. We could have that conversation, sure. But what are we putting back? Like, if I'm not going to show respect to someone older than me by saying sir or ma'am, if I'm going to take that away, how do I show them respect? If I don't show respect to the teacher by shutting my mouth when they're talking, how do I show respect? If I walk into somebody's office and I ask them a question and they start to answer me and I start looking at my phone, is that respectful? Like, what elements of respect are we going to keep? Again, I'm all for transitions. Fine. But what are we doing to respect? We see this all the time in households, husbands and wives. Where is the respect? How do you show respect to your spouse that is obvious to everyone in the house that you respect them? You say, well, I don't think I should have to do that anymore. I don't think I should have to do that anymore. Okay, maybe that's how your parents did it. Fine. But how do you do it? Because it's not okay to just remove respect. If you want to change what you're going to do to be respectful, that's probably okay, but what is it? Can't just keep taking stuff away. Jesus put it in this context. He said, when you walk into, in Luke chapter 14, he said, when you walk in to a banquet, somewhere to sit, like you're going to sit down and eat. He said, don't go pick the best seat and just sit there. Rather, kind of hang back and take a seat at a less desirable place. And then if it's appropriate, the host of the feast will move you to the better seat. And then he goes on in verse 11 and he explains it like this. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted. I'm one of these where, as a parent, I actually really believe in sort of the metrics of the strengths movement. I like the idea of finding the things that our kids are good at or people are good at and just encouraging them in those spaces. And the thing that they're not great at, they just need to be good enough to get by and let that be that. We're gonna support and promote the thing that somebody's great at, and we're just gonna get through the thing that they're not. Like, as such, people complain about participation trophies and all this. What's wrong with telling somebody that participated, hey, you know what, you stuck it out, good job? It doesn't say number one on the trophy. You're not giving them a blue ribbon. But what's wrong with looking at somebody who did something that was hard for them to do and saying, hey, man, you did it. Like, can't we give encouragement where encouragement is due? And in this conversation, it's almost like we're trying to tell parents that you need to dial back the encouragement of your kids, or you need to dial back appreciating people who just try stuff. Could we be okay with celebrating each other? Could we just be okay with celebrating our kids? Now, that said, here is a problem. As we are celebrating people are letting that create in them an entitlement or an ego that is actually harmful to society. And we're trying to fix it by telling parents to stop giving participation trophies or stop being so encouraging. Here's all we need to do to fix it, is to tell the people who have become arrogant because they refuse to give respect where respect is owed, that they need to dial their self-importance back and recognize who in the room has been there longer and respect them, or who in the room might be a little better at that than they are and give respect to them. The answer is not to be less encouraging. The answer is for us to be more humble. Humility is the answer. And this is why Jesus is like, hey, look, here's the thing. If you step into a room, I don't care how awesome you think you are. You go sit in the least desirable seat, and the person who's hosting is gonna come up and they're gonna see you and they're gonna promote you in front of everybody. In a generation that is so into broadcasting yourself and promoting yourself, maybe let somebody else promote you. Because when we do that, then we have promotion that comes from the Lord. But here's the thing. If I'm always looking to take respect, I'm not walking into a room with a mindset to give respect. We need to give respect to whom respect is owed. Because here's what happens. Here's what is happening. As we are less aware of the respect that we owe and giving respect, here's what else is dropping off. Honor. Honor. Honor is a different word. There's a lot of times honor and respect are used simultaneously in the scriptures, and that is fine. But when you see them used together, there's something greater. So there is respect that is shown because it's owed, but then it says there's honor. Now, where do we see honor? Honor your father and your mother so that your days will be long on the earth. There is a blessing of long, healthy life that is attached to our willingness to honor our parents. Let me just say this. If you don't respect teachers and professors and bosses, you will not honor your parents. You won't honor your parents. And as we have stopped honoring our parents, we're also dropping respect off everywhere else. Why? Because they're connected. Here's who else we honor. Honor the Lord. Proverbs 3:9. Honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce. There is something that costs us in order to give to God. If we're not willing to give respect in a room because we think it might cost us a little social clout, we're not going to give him honor when it costs us from what we have. We respect and we honor. He says each one must give. Let me just say, giving, it's not something that we get to do or to not do. We must give. This is the command. Each one must give. But what do I give? How much do I give? Now he gets into how we're going to discern or decide how much that you are to give. He says, as you decide in your heart. Each one must give as he has decided in his heart. How do you feel about the person who's in front of you, and what are you deciding to give to them? How are you going to give to them? Your heart, actually your heart posture matters. Let's look at it like this. There was this moment in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 5, when the church was new. And when the church was new, people had stuff, but the church didn't have stuff. And then there were other people who were coming into the church who had left stuff, they had left family in order to say yes to Jesus. And when they said yes to Jesus, what faith they were in before rejected them and kept from them inheritance and kept from them resources. But now it didn't matter to them. They were willing to sacrifice everything in order to say yes to Jesus. And so now you have in the church a mix of people, those who had stuff and those who didn't have stuff. And it so burdened the people in the church of what they had, seeing people that had nothing, that they actually took from their abundance. They took things lands that they weren't living on, or lands that they had that they weren't using or cultivating or whatever, and they sold things, and then they brought the full amount of what they sold into the church. They gave it to the apostles, and they said, here, distribute this as people have need. And it said because of the generosity of these, that there wasn't anyone in the local church that had a need. Not one. But here's what we have to see. There was not a command for them to do that. It was just a free will offering. If I can use the language of the Old Testament, it was a free will offering. They decided on their own that they were going to do this. This is why our text says each one must give as he has decided in his heart. And so they decided in the book of Acts that they were going to sell stuff and bring stuff. And so there was one couple, a wealthy couple, Ananias and Sapphira. They had a piece of land that they decided they were going to sell. And when everybody came in and said, yes, I sold this and I sold it for all of this and I'm giving all of this into the local church, they wanted to do the same thing. So they walk in and they said, yes, we sold the land for this much and we're giving this much to the church. And Peter discerned that what they were saying wasn't true. And he said, you sold it for this much? Yep. And you're giving that much? Yep. And then this is what he says in verse 4 of chapter 5. He says, let me understand this. While the land was unsold, it remained your own. And after it was sold, was it not at your disposal? In other words, the question is, when you owned the land and it was unsold, wasn't it yours to do with it whatever you wanted to do? And the answer was yes. And then once you sold it and you had all the proceeds, weren't the proceeds at your disposal so you could disperse it however you wanted to? You could have walked in here and said, I sold it for 100, I kept 50, here's 50. You could have done that. What was the issue being dealt with? The heart of the person and our willingness to be honest, not only with ourselves, but our willingness to be honest with the Holy Spirit of God. And this is what's being brought into question. Are we being sparing with our gift, or are we being bountiful? Like that's the question, and it's not whether you're going to give or not. We must give, but are we going to give sparingly, or are we going to give bountifully? So they said that they did this and they didn't, and the story actually didn't end very well at all. If you're new to church, they died. They died for lying to God. They didn't die because they didn't give God all the money for the land. They died because they lied to the Spirit of God. The posture of our heart actually matters. We see this with Cain and Abel. We go all the way back to the book of Genesis. God had established that there would be an offering that he would require, a sacrifice that he would require for the purpose of keeping them right in his presence. We see later in the law that without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins. And so Abel would come into the presence of God and he would give God a blood sacrifice because that is what made atonement a temporary forgiveness for his sinfulness so that he could stand in the presence of God. Well, Cain saw that Abel gave his stuff, but rather than give a blood sacrifice, Abel decided he was going to give something from the ground. So he was giving a thanksgiving. He was giving a grain, the kind of the equivalent of what would become a grain sacrifice. Like, here, God bless me, I'm going to give this back to you. And God said, that's not what I'm asking for right now. I'm not dealing with your provision right now. I'm dealing with your heart right now. And you need to offer a blood sacrifice so we can have these conversations. And Cain was not willing to do it. And here's the language that God comes in and he says, if you did the right thing, would you not be accepted? There is something about the offering that we offer that needs to be accepted. And that will always exploit sort of the posture of our heart. We see this with... We see this when Jesus was watching what people brought into the synagogue and gave to God. And he said, look, let me just say this to you. If you come up here to give something and you remember that your brother has something against you, then you need to leave your gift. Don't give it yet, just leave it. Go fix stuff and then come back to give it. Why? Because the condition, the posture of your heart before you give actually matters. This is going to test every single one of us in 2 weeks. Thanksgiving. How many of you have crazy people in your family? It just is what it is, right? And there's stuff we have to fix. We have to constantly fix stuff. Now, that doesn't mean you always can. We see this in Romans chapter 12 and verse 18. It says, as much as it depends on you, if possible, live peaceably with all. It's not always possible. But you try, and you keep trying. Let me just say this. Some of you quit trying a couple of years ago. I get it. It was year after year after year after year. I understand. But don't stop trying. As much as it depends on you, if at all possible, live peaceably with all. So Jesus is saying, look, I need you to go fix stuff so you put your heart in the right place, because then you can come and give your offering and it will be accepted. We have to have our heart in the right place in order for the gift to be accepted. And here's the thing. This is where we have to realize that even if we choose to do something on our own, where it would be called free will, we still have to give by God's rules. And that's why we have the gospel. That's why we have instructions that tell us how to do the things that we actually want to do from our heart. We see this established way back in Leviticus chapter 22 and verse 21. It says, if anyone would offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving, that would be to the Lord to fulfill a vow or as a free will offering from the flock or the herd. To be accepted, it must be perfect and without blemish in it. Now here's what is being established way back then that actually we still probably have to deal with it a little bit today. You don't have to raise your hands or anything, but does anybody, if you have something that you don't need anymore, you just would take it to a thrift store and just deliver it then? Because you have that option. You can do that, or you can risk your life on Facebook Marketplace and have strangers come to your home and you could, sell things. I mean, there are people who do that. I love that Nate Marquette. See, $5. That's the risk. The risk is that you die. The reward is you made $5 on a trinket out of your cabinet that nobody even wanted. So, to avoid risk of death, you just take it somewhere and give it to them, right? And then they take it and sell it, and they help people that are less fortunate. Here's the thing. I just do that. Absolutely do that. Top Buttons, they appreciate you bringing your stuff. Let me just say this. We give a shout out to Top Buttons here. We love supporting them. They're fine people. If you have good stuff, go take it to them. They do amazing things with it, and they bless girls' lives because of what you do. So great place. Great place. Now let's talk about not the good stuff that you take to them. Let's talk about the junk that you take to Goodwill. I want to make sure we have a separation here. So Christmas is coming up, and you're going to clean out your closet because you're hoping for some new clothes, right? So you're going to take out all the crummy stuff that you like, the junk you don't wear, you don't like it. It's got a stain on it. It's the paint shirt. It's a shirt you wear to paint in, but you need room. So what do? You go take that to Goodwill. This is what this text is saying. Don't mistake that for something you're giving from a generous heart to God, because they're not the same. And when we're not honest about that stuff, here's what's happening in our generation. We are calling generosity taking junk off of the shelves in our homes that we are replacing, and we're taking that and we're giving it to somebody, and we walk away like, whoa, man, I did a great thing today. All you did was take junk out of your house and give it away because you wanted it off the shelf. Now, it'll be used for a great cause, so that's better than the marketplace, I'm telling you. But don't mistake that for what you would give to God. He says what you're going to give to him has to be given from a different posture. David one time said, no, I'm not giving anything that doesn't cost me something. So this is good to do. It's just not always a representative of a generous heart. This over here that we give to him that has no blemish, that is the sign of a generous heart. Your heart actually matters. Your heart posture actually matters. So then he moves in, he says, okay, from your heart, you decide that you're going to give, but what is it that you're going to give? He says, you're either going to give sparingly or you're going to give bountifully. Now, when these words are used, it can create a little bit of creativity in the giver. And this is where a lot of conversation happens sometimes among church folks, where it becomes, do I have to give this much or do I have to give that much? And so now we have to bring up the words that have been used in the gospel that mark how much we give, because we need to know how to put them. We need to know how to categorize them. So we would give an offering, or we would give a tithe. So by definition, a tithe is 10% of something specific. That's what a tithe is. A tithe is based on what you have already received. If someone gives you $100 and you're going to tithe on $100, you're going to give to God $10. That is a tithe. If you were given 100 and you say, I'm going to tithe $12, you're not tithing $12, you are tithing $10, and there's a $2 offering. I'm only being super specific because it's going to matter in a minute. If you give $3, if you made 100 and you walk in and you say, I'm going to tithe $3 today, that's not a tithe. That's 3%, not 10%. A tithe is 10%. Everything else, before or after, everything else is an offering. And so when I understand that, it allows me to deal with the language of sparing or bountiful. The only gift that uses the word full is the word tithe. So in the history of the gospel, we see the full tithe used, or bountiful. So we only see that concept attached to tithing, or 10%. Everything else is everything else. If it's more than 10%, it's more than bountiful. If it's less than, then it's considered sparing. Bountiful, more than bountiful, sparing. Now, to get there, let's go to the Old Testament, work our way into the New Testament. Because I don't want you to just take my word for it, because this is the question that gets asked a lot. People ask me all the time, do I have to tithe? No, you don't have to tithe. No one has to tithe. You don't have to tithe. You don't have to gather in God's house. You don't have to lift your hands and give glory and honor and praise to Jesus. You don't have to raise your voice and exalt his name. You don't have to do any of these things. The question is, Do we have the opportunity? Do we have the invitation to do these things? And is there still the blessing of God upon our obedience to these things? That's the question. The question is not, do I have to? The question is, does it still matter? So now to get there, let's work our way from the beginning all the way to the end. Let's go to Genesis chapter 14 and verse 18, the first time that we see this word tithe. It says that Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought bread and wine out. He was the priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. For he, and blessed be God Most High, for he has delivered your enemies into your hand." And Abram gave Melchizedek a tithe of everything. He gave him a tenth of everything. So the story is that Abraham went out and he fought a battle and he got back his nephew Lot and his family and his stuff and all the stuff that went back to Sodom and Gomorrah. And he said of all the stuff that he got for them and all the stuff that he had for himself, the spoil, the reward of his effort, he took 10% of that and he gave it to God. Why? Because he recognized God as the one who blessed him with what he had. The tithe is simply a thanksgiving to God in recognition of what he has already given you. God gave Abraham the victory. He gave him this, and then Abraham gave God that. He gave him a tithe to say thank you. There was no command. There was no demonstration. There was no letter. There was nothing but a man who had a heart after God, who loved God and wanted to give something back to the one who had given to him. Okay, this began to be the habit of Abraham, or the lifestyle of Abraham, so that it was transferred to the life of his son Isaac and then his grandson Jacob. Here's what I realized. Generosity is harder for people that didn't grow up around generosity. It's something that you really have to work on and train yourself in because it might not be natural to you. There are some houses that you can grow up in that are sort of selfish. There are people who they're selfish with each other, with their spouse. There are people who are selfish with their kids. There are people who are selfish with the community or with church or whatever. They're just not giving people. But then there are people who are, and when you grow up in a house like that, you learn their habits. So now we have this moment where Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, he is going to follow the path that God has him on. He was leaving his home, going to find a wife. He takes a nap. And in that place where he's taking a nap, God gives him a vision. God shows up. And then God, like he sees all of this and he wakes up and God blesses him and he says, "Okay, God, I'm going to make a deal." He said he stacked stones in Genesis chapter 28 and verse 22. Said he stacked stones and said, "This shall be the house of God. And all that you give to me, I will give to you a full tithe." Full tithe, the full 10%. And here's the thing, he wandered off, got married, worked for 20 years, and God prospered him. And then on his way back to that place that he called Bethel, he met God again. And he wrestled with God, and they had this moment, and God then renamed him Israel. And this is where after his wrestling, he walked around with a limp. And so now he limps back to that place with his family, with his stuff, but he goes back to that place to fulfill his vow to God. Let me just sidebar. Some weeks, man, you come limping in on Sunday morning. Like, it's a bad one, y'all. Oh, you come in, you took a beating. Like, it's just one of those. I see a few hands like, ooh. But just that you made it to the altar of God. Just that you got back to that stack of stones. He brought back a tithe to fulfill that vow. Push a little further. Now we get into the law. And what the law did was take things a lot of times that God's people had done because of their relationship with him, and it was like, well, that works, so it made it law. In other words, it made it a command. Worked for them will work for us. Tithing was one of those things. Worked for them would work under the law, and it was commanded under the law. We see this in Leviticus chapter 27 and verse 30. It says, the tithe of the land is the Lord's. It is holy to him. And the tithe of the flock and the herds, every 10th animal, is holy to the Lord. If the tithe was holy under the law, if it's holy, was it not holy before the law? Of course it was. Would the tithe be just as holy after the law? Of course it was. Now let's just keep moving now into the prophets. This is like the biggest promise probably that we see around surrounding your resources in the gospel. It's why everybody knows this text. Malachi chapter 3 and verse 10. It says, bring the full tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house, and thereby put me to the test, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open up the windows of heaven for you and pour down for you a blessing until there is no more need. And I will rebuke the devourer for you, so that it will not destroy the fruit of your soil, and the vine of your field will not fail to bear, declares the Lord of hosts. Who's making the promise? God Almighty, the creator of heaven and earth, the possessor of heaven and earth. Who's making the promise? God is. What is the promise on? It's on your tithe. If you bring your full 10% and you give it to him, then he made you a promise that he would open up his windows and pour out a blessing until you have no more need. And on top of that, he would even rebuke the devourer for your sake. But let's not miss what he said. Bring it. Like, bring it. He doesn't just want your stuff. God wants you to actually show up in his house. He wants you to be in his presence. He wants you to be surrounded by his people. It's not just for your things. It's because God wants your heart. Like, this is what we see from the beginning, sometimes especially in the age of online church and all this conversation. Can I just go back? He said, bring. It matters all the way. Going back to the book of Genesis, we see Adam and Eve in the garden with God. God would come down into the garden and meet with them at a specific time in a specific place. And when we weren't there, what did God say? Where are you? Where are you? They were there. They weren't there. There was something about gathering with God. There's something about going to the place where he said he would be. He said, my presence will fill my house. So there was something about going to where God was. And then we see this moment where Abraham met with God when he made it to the promised land, where God said, this is where I'm going to be. And he named that place Shechem. He named that place where God met with him. And then we see his grandson name that place Bethel. Why? Because he said, this is the house of God. And then we see the tabernacle that the people of Israel built, and it was put in the middle. Why was it put in the middle? Because they wanted God in the middle of every single thing that they did. And there was the tabernacle, and they all surrounded it. But on the Sabbath, they would gather. Why would they gather? To bring him offering, to bring him praise, to be in his presence. There's something about coming, gathering to the house of the Lord. And then they built a temple on top of the Mount Zion, and that temple was where God said, I'm going to put my name right there. And then there was this moment of argument. Is God in Samaria? Is God in Jerusalem? And Jesus said, the hour is coming, and now is, where it's not going to be about this mountain or that mountain. What was he saying? He was prophesying that there would be a moment where anywhere in the world, if just 2 or 3 would gather in his name, there he would be in the midst of them. So the same presence of God that would fill this tabernacle is the same presence of God that filled this temple, is the same presence of God that fills this room right now, because we have gathered in his name. And when we gather in his name, what did he say? Bring me something. Oh, and what you bring me, I will bless bountifully. until there is no more need. So we have a choice. Do we give sparingly? Will there be a blessing? There will be a sparing blessing on a sparing gift. Or do we give bountifully? Because there's a bountiful blessing on a bountiful gift. The God who made the promise is the same God who will bless you and keep you and prosper you and rebuke the devourer for your sake. If the promise was true under the old covenant, if the promise was true by faith before the old covenant, then the promise remains true today. If you sow bountifully, he will bless you bountifully.